Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is DiSpigna, and we're delighted to welcome back our friend and guest host, J.L. Bell, the author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and also creator of the popular blog, 1775. Today, we'll be speaking with Nina Sankovitch, and we're going to discuss the three leaders of the Boston Sons of Liberty in the years preceding the revolution, as well as their wives and their families.
Nina Sankovitch has written books about a range of topics, including the pleasures of reading and the pleasures of letter writing. In The Lowells of Massachusetts, she traced the fortunes of one family that rose to prominence just after the American Revolution. Her latest book goes further back to how that revolution began in Massachusetts, and in particular to three intertwined families. American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy families fanned the flames of revolution, explores how the desire for independence cut across class lines, blending people together as they pursued their common goals of liberty, opportunity, and stability. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy this worked out. So happy to
We really appreciate it. So let me just ask you this. So your book, American Rebels, it starts in the town of Braintree, which is now Quincy. So what was that place like in the mid-1700s, and what was its place in the British Empire?
Well, it was a small village, but it had three churches, had a thriving community. It had actually a very interesting history because the area where Braintree was happened to have been the same location that a lot of different sort of rebellious activities took place long before the American Revolution. For example, the first English settlers that came included a man, Wollaston, who brought along with him a bunch of indentured men who he planned to sell to fishing ventures up and down the coast. And along with him was a wonderful guy, Thomas Morton. Well, wonderful in my view, maybe not everybody's, but he was an entertaining fellow. And he decided that he just loved this land of Braintree. And Wollaston went down south to try to find places to sell his men to. And Morton told the men on the hill, hey, look, you can be free. Join me. Let's set up a community here on this hill. We'll call it Marimont, view of the sea. And we're going to get along with the Native Americans. We're going to sell them arms and we're going to get furs. And then they set up a thriving economy. But of course, first the settlers at Plymouth and then later the Puritans did not like these goings-ons because they had big May Day parties and they fraternized with Native Americans in all kinds of ways that were upsetting to the Pilgrims and to the Puritans. And so finally, Morton was evicted, sent back to England, town was burned down, and the Governor Winthrop of Massachusetts Bay said, okay, now we're going to make sure this land gets into the hands of good Congregationalists. That included the Quincy's, who had recently arrived from England, and the Coddingtons and the Hutchinsons. Well, one of the Hutchinsons was Anne Hutchinson, who said, I may be a Congregationalist, but I'm a different kind of Congregationalist than all of you because I'm a better Congregationalist. I speak directly to God. You all don't. Governor Winthrop, you don't know what you're talking about. I can lead these people. The Congregationalist church cannot. Oh, so she was kicked out of Massachusetts, kicked out of the church. And then the hill that had been going by the name of Marymount was then recalled Mount Wollaston. And finally we think, okay, we're going to settle down. But no, then we have the Hancock, Quincy, and Adams families all come to this village. The Quincy's are already there. The Hancocks come through Reverend John Hancock, who comes to be their pastor in the early 18th century of the Third Parish Church. He's going to be the minister there. The Adams have been there already for a while, and they really represent three different, what was so fascinating to me, not only is to find that the Adams, Quincy, and Hancock families were all living in Braintree, but that they all represented different classes within Braintree. Now, there was not this big divide, this big class structure in the 18th century village in New England. It was, everybody lived side by side. Everybody went to the same schools, same churches. So, but it was that the Quincy's were sort of the landed gentry. John Adams' family were the yeomen, and the Hancocks were the ministers, and then John Hancock, through his uncle, became the newly rich. So I found these three families, and these three families all came to support revolution against England, came not only to support it, really to lead it. And not only the men of the families, but the women of the families. We have Abigail Adams, who really grew up, spent much of her childhood in Braintree. She was a Quincy on her mother's side. We have Dolly Quincy, who married John Hancock, who's Quincy, grew up in Braintree. And then the other women who came into the lives of the men, like Josiah Quincy's wife, Abigail. And so we have these men and women, different classes, all becoming fed up with the way England is managing their colony, and all becoming leaders in the move for independence. It was such an incredible community to study in that way,
Right.
because it had all the elements I was interested in.
Right. Thank you.
You've told us a little bit about the Reverend John Hancock and how he came to Braintree. Tell us about Deacon John Adams. What was his role? How important was he in the community? And also how Josiah Quincy Sr., the father of the patriot you focused on, how he made his money. Okay.
Well, so Deacon Adams was a solid citizen. And it was when he finally was able to own his own property that he became deacon, and also had a voice in the politics of his little village of Braintree. And he was very active in his village. He felt a real responsibility to his community. He had these children, John, Peter, Elihu. He was married to Susanna Boylston, who came from really a higher class background than Deacon Adams did. But she married Deacon Adams and moved to his farmhouse. And because he was such a giving soul and was always wanting to help his community, they had people in and out of their not very large house just constantly, not only relatives, but anybody in the town who needed a place to stay. If someone had become homeless, he'd say, oh, come on in and live with me for a while. Susanna was not crazy about that. She didn't like all these people coming in and out. She didn't like her husband giving money away. She tried to manage the finances. What that meant is that the household that John Adams grew up in was quite topsy-turvy, a little bit chaotic, but it also for John Adams, his father was a hero. He was such a giving man, so generous to his community, so caring, and looking out for his sons. So that's John Adams' story. Chaotic background, solid yeoman farmer. Then we have the Quincy's. There are a bunch of Quincy's living in Braintree, and John Adams knows them all. He goes to school with them, and later he will join them all at Harvard, although he'll join them a little bit later than they all go, because he needs to make up some work. So Josiah Quincy, he makes his money because he is somebody who imports and exports things, mainly imports things. And he travels all around the world. And then by chance, one of the ships that he owns, along with his brother Edmund Quincy, who also lives in Braintree, it's a small ship, but they come across a big Spanish galleon in the middle of the night off like the coast of Gibraltar. And they say, I think we can take this. So this big Spanish galleon surrenders to this small ship because it's nighttime and they don't really realize that it's a small little ship with not a lot of arms or a lot of men, but they surrender, and it turns out to have a fortune on board. A fortune, most of which will go to the Quincy family. It's the business of Quincy, and Jackson. Edmund and Josiah's brother-in-law, Edward Jackson, is their partner. And it just makes a fortune for Josiah and for Edmund Quincy. And both of them have homes well, Josiah has a home in Boston. Edmund has a home in Braintree. They both make their homes that they have beautiful, and they both buy more homes. So Josiah Quincy is going to build a house in Braintree. Edmund's going to beautify his house in Braintree. Now Edmund goes through that money pretty darn quickly. And he is the father of Dolly Quincy, who will become Dolly Hancock, Dorothy Hancock, John Hancock's wife. She's the youngest child, and she really experiences this sort of wealth. The family had always been comfortable, but all of a sudden they're wealthy. But she will also experience the downturn when Edmund goes bankrupt from spending so much money. So her attitude towards security, money, family stability is all, I think, formed by her childhood, and makes her more sort of open to the idea of independence from England. But interestingly enough, she is not so eager to marry John Hancock as you think she might be. Their courtship is very long and drawn out. And I think part of the reason is she just has to be sure about anything she's getting into.
You know, one of the things I loved about your book is that you really paint a personal picture of all these people, because you can really relate. You talk about heartbreak, you talk about loss of fortunes that you just pointed out when they capture that Spanish ship and then they spend too much money. But I wanted to focus a little bit on John Adams, right? Because he's on a lower socioeconomic rung than the Hancock families, the Quincy families. And when I'm reading about you describe his childhood, he prefers farming to schooling. He comes from a little bit of a volatile parental relationship, but yet his own relationship with Abigail is one of a lot of loving. And I love that you pointed out that he wrote in one of his letters that he talked about, 1,000 kisses or something like that they had exchanged. But can you explain to us sort of this metamorphosis that transforms John Adams into a scholar, a voracious reader, a lawyer, and really a rebel?
Right. Well, it is true that when he was young, and what we would call probably junior high age for us, he really hated school. Did not want to go to school. He said to his father, "I want to be a farmer." And his father sent him out to the fields to see if hard work could rid him of that idea. But John's like, "No, I still want to be a farmer." And finally, he admitted to his father, "My school teacher is terrible. He's lazy, he's mean, he's just a bad teacher." And so this is such a credit to the father that he said, "Okay, well, we're going to find you a better teacher, and because education is everything, and we are going to get you educated." So that was the role the father played. Now, the mother, I think, also had a role to play in John's ambition, which is that she always felt she was a little bit better than everyone else in Braintree. She came from a better background. She lived in a bigger house, and she instilled in John, "You're better than this. You're better." So once once his father found the right teacher for him, he became an avid student. His new teacher gave him a copy of Cicero. He carried that copy of Cicero with him basically for the rest of his life. He internalized these ambitions of his mother. And I think he saw his childhood friends like John Hancock being elevated and finding riches. And it kind of peeved him a little bit, because John Hancock's riches came through his uncle. What had John done? John Hancock hadn't done anything special in John Adams' opinion. So he set this personal challenge for himself. I'm going to work hard and I'm going to succeed. And what I love about John Adams is you go through his diaries, and he kept diaries which are wonderful, and it's so great that we have them. And you can see that, just like all of us, he would set these big goals. I'm going to study. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to chase women. And then a week later, like, "Oh, well, okay, now today I'm going to study." And so he would keep sort of not quite reaching his goals, but keep striving for them. And slowly, he did reach all of his goals. But he definitely had a much harder row to hoe than his fellow compatriots from Braintree. For example, Samuel Quincy also became a lawyer, and to become a lawyer, you went through Harvard and then you did a clerkship. Well, Sam Quincy got a great clerkship because his father was connected. John Adams didn't get a great clerkship. He was out in the boonies doing, this law that didn't really interest him. But in fact, he was a teacher for a while before he went into the law. But he just kept going and going. And sometimes I wonder, what did Abigail see in him? He could be such a, such a peevish, complaining type of guy. But I think that's what she saw in him, that he really was driven by ambition for himself, But coming from his sort of father's influence, he also had incredible ambition for his community, and he, for whom he felt was in his community. And that's what made him the rebel that he became. He cared so much for the people of Braintree and the people of Massachusetts, and he wanted their rights to be recognized. And if the British weren't going to recognize them, well, then we don't need the British. And we can lay at his feet, really, the construction of the American government and the papers that he wrote, the canon on feudal law. It set the whole course for the American government. And I'm not sure everyone realizes that, but what I really tried to do in my book was show these incredible people from history were human beings.
Yes.
With their foibles and their flaws and their loves and their disappointments. And to me, that just makes them so much more heroic.
Yes. And I love that you added that he signed his name 6 times on that copy of Cicero.
Yeah. My book, this is my name, yeah.
I see that a lot in schoolboys' books. They're really proud, many of them, of that little property that they had. You've alluded to John Hancock's story a couple of times, but I want you to tell us how he went from being, he was the third John Hancock in a line, at least. His grandfather was a very respected clergyman. His father was a clergyman. And then suddenly when his father died, well, because they were a minister, the house they were living in belonged to the town or to the congregation. So he and his mother and his younger siblings didn't even have a home, and they had to move in with grandfather. And how did he go from that to owning the biggest, grandest house on Beacon Hill?
And it really was an incredible transformation, because as you say, once Reverend John Hancock died, his wife, Mary, the kids, they were homeless. Reverend Hancock's father took them in. They went to live in Lexington, but it wasn't a luxurious life. The boys were not going to go to school. They were going to go to work. The widow was going to go to work. There was not going to be any luxury in John Hancock's life. But John Hancock's father had a brother, Thomas Hancock, who at the age of like 13 went to Boston and started a internship, a clerkship, whatever we would call it, with a bookbinder. And when he reached the end at 21, done his 7 years service, he started his own bookshop. And then he was talking about ambition. He quickly started to not only trade in books, but he started to trade in anything coming in and out of Boston. He got married to the daughter of another bookseller who'd also branched out into all kinds of industry. And he built this incredible mega fortune out of trading just about anything, selling just about anything. He built his own ships. He made a lot of money during the French and Indian War because he supplied the British with the food, clothes, arms, anything they needed for the war. So he made a lot of money off of that war. And he loved his wife, and he built this big mansion for her on Beacon Hill. And the only thing they didn't have was a child. So when John Hancock was orphaned, they said, you know what, we're going to raise that boy, and we're going to raise him like our own. And they went to Lexington and picked him up and brought him back to Boston and gave him, they tutored him for a while because he was sickly as a child. And I had not realized, I'd never known that about John Hancock, about how sick he was during so much of his life. And yet he kept going. And then he ended up going to Harvard and following in the footsteps of his uncle. And his uncle left his business to him when he died. And that's how John Hancock came into his fortune. Now, a lot of men would say, okay, that's my fortune, I'm good. And they would have stayed loyal to the king because he was doing just fine. But instead, he put that fortune on the line for his community. He bankrolled a lot of the early years of agitation. I could go on and on, but I think I've answered your question about where John Hancock got his money. John Hancock, but I did
the old-fashioned way, he inherited it.
Exactly.
Well, let's kind of switch to Josiah Quincy Jr. and really he's the least known of these 3 characters that you write about. So and he was the only one who wasn't an eldest son. So what was his personality and really what drove him?
Yeah, well, what a character. And interestingly enough, he also was very sickly as a child, which meant he was home in bed a lot. And what he did to entertain himself was he read. And he read and he read and he read. He was a voracious reader and note taker. He wrote in his books. He kept journals about what he read. And he had very strong ideas, again, it's passed down from his family, but also I think from the community in which he lived, Braintree, this idea of duty to community, of faith, and there was also this sense, God is on our side in America. He's, God brought us here. God made us flourish. God's on our side. So when there started to be problems with England, there was no doubt in Josiah Quincy's mind that God was on the side of the colonists, not the side of the king, not the side of Parliament. Or he certainly wrote that way. His rhetorical flourishes were incredible. And he always couched things in terms of the evils being wrought upon the colonies and how God was going to protect them, but that they also had to fight for themselves against these evils coming from other places. So his personality was formed largely by the books that he read, the community that he grew up in, and the illness that he really battled against his whole life. Now, Dr. Warren was, of course, his doctor, which is a wonderful connection. And Warren was the doctor to the Adams and the Adams kids. And as I said, Josiah Quincy, and he was everybody's sort of go-to doctor. And in fact, Josiah Quincy's wife really credited him with keeping her husband alive for as long as he did stay alive.
Let's talk about those three men's wives. You've mentioned a bit. There's a complicated familial relationship linking all three men through their wives, through their marriages. Yeah. But also tell us about the women's personalities and how each of them approached or didn't approach political matters as their husbands became more and more involved.
Okay. There was Abigail, and Dolly are the ones you want to know about. Abigail Quincy, Abigail Adams, and Dolly Hancock. Okay. I just have to say, I'm so grateful that her name was Dorothy and not Abigail or Hannah, because there's such a repetition of names. At least Dorothy Hancock had her own name. They were certainly very different, each from the other. But of course, Dolly Quincy and Abigail Adams had known each other for a long time. I mean, Dolly Quincy was a bit younger than Abigail and would always be the little Quincy girl, whereas Abigail Adams was friends with Dolly's older sisters as more contemporaries. Josiah Quincy's wife, Abigail, came from a wealthy Boston family, very interested in education, founded Phillips Academy, and she very much valued education, and she read a lot, and she was a good fit for Josiah Quincy in that they both just loved to read, and they both they were both very devout, but not devout in the way where the minister tells you what to do, devout in the way that I know what God expects of me on this earth, and I'm going to do my utmost to reach that. So not in a following kind of way, but in a, I've been placed on earth for a purpose. Okay. And for Abigail Quincy, who married Josiah, that purpose would be keeping her husband's memory alive long after he was gone and raising a son to become the leader that he became, mayor of Boston, president of Harvard, representative, senator, and everything that he was, and a leading abolitionist. All of these things came out of Abigail saying, my purpose is to raise a son worthy of this incredible husband that I lost, and he's carrying on my husband's legacy. So that's Abigail Quincy, married to Josiah. Abigail Smith Adams, married to John Adams. She is much more practical. I'm running things around here. She's the one who held the farm together. She held that when they were living in Boston. She kept that household going. Her sort of reaction to the British coming into the colony, she had visceral experience of that. She was living in Boston. They lived across the street from when the troops started coming to Boston, 1768. They start coming. They are not seen as a oh great, they're here to help us. They were definitely seen as a occupying force, even though they were British, and Abigail, and everyone was British at the time. Abigail saw those troops as an occupying force, and she turned early on against the idea of remaining under control of England. I mean, as early as 1773, she was saying, no, we should be independent. We should be on our own. We have to take care of ourselves. So, and that grew out of her sort of practical experience of trying to run a household, get food on the table, keep them above water, because John Adams was always in financial struggles. He was always losing money. He was always not making enough. He was always betting on the wrong horse. And so she was practical, down to earth. Then we have Dorothy Hancock, Dolly Quincy. She did not marry Hancock until 1775. They were together for years before then. And everyone says, when are you going to get married? There were rumors that John had someone on the side, but Dolly Quincy, her motivations, I think, came from, as I said earlier, she had a childhood where she was well educated and often cosseted, but also saw the ups and downs of, how finances could go up and down. I haven't yet talked about her father, who's actually one of my just favorite guys in the book, Edmund Quincy, her father. He did have a lot of ups and downs in his life, but he was another one of these fellows who just believed God has a plan, and I am so grateful for everything he does for me. So he never lost hope. He never was in despair. And I think he communicated to Dorothy, just keep trusting in yourself. God's watching out for you. Be grateful for everything you have. And Dorothy was happy to take that as it came. And she was a great support to John Hancock, even when he would say, you haven't written to me, you're not doing anything for me. And she would quickly knit him something and say, here you go, you happen. And then when they were finally married, she stepped up to the plate completely and really helped him out. He was serving as president of the Continental Congress, and he needed help because he was suffering terribly from gout. So she was basically his secretary, and at times the secretary of the whole Congress. So you have these three very different women driven from different desires and needs. And like Dolly Hancock was before the boycotts had started against England. She was very interested in fashion. She loved to dress well. She loved to have her ribbons. Abigail Adams was never really interested in any of that, nor really was Abigail Quincy. So it's just interesting to see the different personalities come through by reading their letters. Abigail Adams, of course, left so many letters. Dolly, fewer letters. Abigail Quincy, fewer letters still. But what we have is we try to glean as much as we can from the words they left behind.
Yeah. And I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it's important. You really kind of answered the question, but I just want to get back to John Hancock for a second, because something really stood out for me, because, we know that the British kind of labeled him. I remember this quote, his brain shallow and pockets deep. And, today he's really known for what? His signature, his wealth, a little bit of a dandy. But one thing really stood out that you wrote, and it was a letter that John Adams had written. And he said, not less than 1,000 families depend on Hancock to put food on the table. And that's really an incredible sentence, given that the population of Boston at this time is only around 15,000 people. So can you just give us like a minute or two talking about really how important Hancock was, not only to the town of Boston and helping those colonists living there, but also how he helped to fund the revolutionary movement?
Yeah. I mean, another amazing thing about that letter is that John Adams himself admitted that, because John never wanted to admit, how much John Hancock did. And in fact, much of John Adams' financial troubles were alleviated by the salaries that John Hancock funded for John doing work for the Provincial Congress, his travel expenses to go to the Continental Congress. And he knew if he just gave that money to John Adams, he'd never take it. But John Hancock instead said, I'm going to pay these, I'm going to fund these opportunities we have. I'm going to fund this travel that we have to do. And that way it became acceptable. And what you say is true. He funded so much of the activity that led up to the Declaration of Independence. These actions that the colonists undertook, those cost money to gather to gather the gunpowder you need, to gather the food supplies that you need, to organize people, to hold meetings. All of these things cost money. And he dipped into his coffers to pay for them.
Mhm.
And then with what you say about the 1,000 families dependent, yes, and that was not only through employing people, but he really helped out all of the poor in Boston, and he also gave supplies that people needed. So his work his work was very generous, and it was without this idea of, and what shall I get in return? He really just, once he was in on the movement for independence, he was in all the way. And he wasn't hedging his bets, and he wasn't trying to cover, his assets. He really was all in, and he was willing to put his fortune on the line. And even during the siege of Boston, when George Washington was outside in Cambridge, and he said, I really want to bomb Boston. I want to bomb Boston and get those British out of there. A lot of people said, no, we still have property there. Well, John Adams' fortune was wound up in property held in Boston. And he said, go ahead, because if that's what we have to do to get rid of the British, that's what we'll do.
Right.
Now they ended up coming up with an even better plan, going up to Dorchester and tricking the British into thinking that this fort had been built and their bombings were going to undergo. So his property ultimately was not damaged. And in fact, when the British finally evacuated Boston, and the Americans went in, George Washington and his fellow men went in to see how Boston looked. They were very interested to see that John Hancock's house remained in good condition. And Abigail, I think it was Abigail, wrote to John Adams and said, on the other hand, Samuel Quincy's house was destroyed because even the British know that the men you admire are the men who stand up for something. Now, Samuel Quincy, we haven't talked about yet. He was Josiah Quincy's brother who remained a loyalist through it all, went to England, did not fight in the revolution, did not support the revolution. But his reasons for doing so are the same reasons Josiah had for fomenting revolution. Samuel Quincy also had this commitment to community, but his idea of what his community needed was very different from Josiah's idea. And that's another thing that really interested me in writing this book, was why some people coming from the exact same place with the same held sort of ideals would arrive at two different decisions: to support and stay with England, or to rebel against England.
You mentioned John Hancock as his financial support. He was also a selectman and representative for Boston by the late 1760s. Adams and Quincy were both lawyers, and as you say, Josiah Quincy's brother Samuel was also a lawyer. Also married into that family was Jonathan Sewell, who was John Adams's close friend and a lawyer. And so I wonder, tell us about the role of lawyers on law in what turned out to be a revolution in Massachusetts.
Well, and don't forget that Jonathan Sewell married a Quincy.
Right.
So they're all marrying each other, and a lot of them were lawyers, and a lot of the early arguments for the colonists were very legal arguments, saying, okay, you want to tax us. Josiah Quincy argued, you can tax us, but we have to have a voice in how we're taxed. You violated the law, the British Constitution, which was, not a document, but a series of case law and treaties and other things that make up what they call the British Constitution. He said, you violated the British Constitution. They went at all of the sort of their early protests were almost all formed as legal arguments, as legal cases to be brought against Parliament, against the king. And so what is interesting is that after the Boston Massacre, when you have British soldiers firing on American colonists and killing 5 of them, you have Josiah Quincy Jr. and John Adams representing the British in the cases, in the murder cases. And Josiah Quincy's father was out. What are you doing representing the British? And Josiah Quincy Jr. said, the law is the law, and we follow the law. Everyone deserves a lawyer. Everyone deserves their just defense. And the only way we're going to prove that we as a colony are deserving of our rights is if we show we are just as good as justice as anybody, that we are fair and equal. And he and John Adams faced off against Samuel Quincy, who was prosecuting the officers. So it was this very strange experience. And Samuel Quincy knew it wasn't going to turn out well for him, no matter what happened. Because if the British officers got off, all the colonists would hate him. If they didn't get off, the royal officers that he worked for, the royal officials that he worked for would hate him. So he put up a very lackluster case. John Adams and Josiah Quincy put up a great case, and the soldiers basically were found not guilty. 2 of them were found guilty of manslaughter, got branded, but no one did jail time. No one, was ever hung for any of this. So again, it was the rule of law that was so important to these colonists. And the first case of impeachment in America was brought by John Adams, and he did that to try to get rid of the Chief Justice of the law court in Massachusetts, because the king said, you used to get paid by your fellow colonists, you're now going to get paid by me. And Peter Oliver said, great, fantastic, wonderful, I'm going to get paid so much more being paid by the king. Well, Adams thought that was reprehensible. No, we want to have, if we're going to have impartial courts, we can't have you being paid by the king. So he brought a case of impeachment. Massachusetts House of Representatives voted for impeachment. And again, this was all legal talk, legal, really trying to show we're not wild men. We're not the mobs, because there were mobs, obviously. We're not the mobs. That's my cousin Sam. That's the other people fighting. We are the legal profession. We are staying within the bounds of the law to argue for our rights under the British Constitution. Now, Governor Hutchinson refused to acknowledge the impeachment, and John Adams said, okay, fine. Well, guess what? You're not going to get any jurors. You can keep having Chief Justice Oliver, but people won't serve under him. And that's exactly what happened, is that juror said, I will not serve under an impeached judge. I will not come to court. Courts ground to a standstill. And that was really the start of sort of these civil disobedience measures. We're not going to pay taxes. We're not going to pay duties on tea. We're going to dump the tea in the sea. So it was an escalation that grew out of legal challenges to the British oppressions in the colonies.
Okay, and now to my favorite part of this talk. Tell us about Dr. Joseph Warren and some of his connections to these rebels from Braintree.
Yeah. Well, he as I said, he was their doctor. I mean, Josiah Quincy, when he was just out of college at Harvard, he was diagnosed with consumption. What is tuberculosis. So that's it. That is a death sentence. Right. And the sort of governing logic of the time, or the treatment, was you get bled, you have leeches put on you, you do all of these sort of very painful treatments. But Dr. Warren said, no, that's not what you need to do. You need to lead a sober life, no drinking, no carousing, get a lot of sleep, get a lot of fresh air, eat good food. And Josiah Quincy said, well, I can do all that because I'm not much of a partier the way my brothers are. And he and Dr. Warren became good friends. They spent actually a lot of time together, talking and having those evenings. And Warren was a friend of the Adams family also, who spent evenings at their house. And of course, in addition to having these personal family relationships with the Quincy's and the Adams, and John Hancock, he had political relationships with them. He was like Josiah Quincy Jr. He's one of the forgotten heroes of the American Revolution. I mean, we can lay at his feet the success of the colonists in Lexington and Concord. We can put at his feet, this wonderful speech that he gave on one of the anniversaries of the Boston Massacre, where he was just someone who was able to rally a crowd to his side. And so he was so much more than someone who cared for their physical needs. He also cared for their sort of social needs, and just an incredible man. And one thing that I had not known until I started my research was how his body was identified. after he fell at Bunker Hill, and then a year later they finally can, after the siege of Boston is over, he and his brothers can go look for his body, and they bring Paul Revere along, not only because Paul Revere was a friend, but because Paul Revere had been Warren's dentist and knew what was in, what were the sort of teeth that were in Warren's skull. And that's actually, even though they were able to do some sort of clothing identification of these very decomposed remains, it was really the first CSI case in history where Paul Revere said, I recognize those teeth. I put those in his skull, and this is his body. So he is an incredible, incredible character. And he's in my book a lot because he was in their lives a lot, as I say, as their doctor, as their friend, and as their fellow, co-political, I don't want to say co-conspirator because it sounds like a conspiracy and I don't want to use that word these days, but he was with them all the way.
A fellow rebel.
Yes.
All right. As of early 1775, John Hancock and John Adams were at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. What was Josiah Quincy Jr. doing in that season?
Well, he, in the fall of 1774, he headed out to England because he had an idea. It was really he had an idea that there was still one last chance to reconcile with England. And we have to remember this was a time when there was not fast communication between England and the American colonies. Things took a couple months at best. News took a couple months at best to go back and forth. And they have the same sort of issues with the press as we have today, which is, what's true, what's not. So Josiah had this idea that news reports in England were painting the colonists in a way that the king just didn't really understand what the colonists were really like. And he said, I'm going to go to England. He'd had a diplomatic journey to the South that went pretty well, where he was able to bring a lot of Southerners on board with colonial fervor for fighting for the rights of colonists. And he said, I'm going to go to England. Last is chance. I'm going to talk to the king, and I'm going to talk to Parliament, and I'm going to show them how deserving we are of having our rights restored, and maybe we can have a peaceful reconciliation. So he gets to England, and he's sick. He has consumption. It comes and goes, but he makes the journey. It's not an easy journey, but he arrives in England, and he quickly realizes there's no changing the king's mind. There's no changing Parliament's mind. They think the colonists are ungrateful, undeserving, dirty, rotten scoundrels, and there's not going to be a reconciliation. And he sees that a lot of this has to do with sort of what he sees as bad dealings on the part of the Parliament, those in Parliament, and just false. That the king, whom he had such high hopes for, actually had very different ideals than Josiah Quincy had. And he was really affronted by the huge disparities in wealth and poverty in England, by the frivolity, all these plays were going on and dances were going on and money was being spent on all sorts of things. And they were not the good Puritans, the good Congregationalists that he was used to over there in New England. And he was pretty disgusted by what he saw going on. And he came to see, we're not going to get out of this without a war. And he wrote to his wife, their blood will be shed. We're not getting out of this without a war. He did make contact with some Englishmen and Americans in England who had ideas for how to help the colonists. And there was a plan that was presented to him, this plan that was going to help the colonists in their fighting for their rights. But it wasn't anything that could be written down, because there was a great paranoia that the English were reading any letters that passed back and forth. And it wasn't unjustified paranoia. The English were doing that. They were taking Josiah Quincy's letters and reading them. So Josiah Quincy was given a mission to get on board a ship, go back to America, and relay a message about this plan that these people in England had, We have no idea what that plan was. We have no idea because Josiah Quincy Jr. never wrote it down. No one else ever wrote it down. Josiah got on the ship. He was very ill, and he'd become friends with Ben Franklin in England. And Ben Franklin said, "Don't go. You got to get better. You can't go on the board this ship when you're feeling so ill." And he said, "No, I must go. I must go." And he did. He went, and he made it all the way to the harbor in Gloucester. But he did not make it ashore, and he did not convey his message to anybody. He was able to leave sort of a deathbed message via a sailor on board. He didn't know anything about Lexington and Concord. He'd arrived right after that happened. And his death preceded James Warren's death by just maybe a month, I think, or so. And the double blow of both of them dying, it hit John Adams and Abigail hard. It hit the Quincy family hard. It hit the Hancocks. To lose two of their leaders in such a short time. And I think, Lexington and Concord was definitely like, as John has written about, that was it. There's no going back. That was the road to revolution. Nothing was turning them back. But to lose two of your most sort of soul edifying leaders, people who really drew on the best in you in rising up against the British, to lose two of them in that one season, I think only solidified for Hancock and Adams, we're doing this. We are doing this for the men we've lost. We are not going back, because given they gave up their lives for us, we are not turning back. Would you agree with that? Do you think that?
I think it's especially interesting that Josiah Quincy, as you said, is the little brother in that family and in this group. And Dr. Joseph Warren was only in his early 30s when he died. So this was the next generation of leaders as well. These are the men that people like Adams in his 40s was expecting to succeed him. And suddenly this generation was gone.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah.
And John, weren't you and I just going kind of back and forth about how many revolutionary leaders were lost in that one year?
In the previous fall, there was a big loss with Dr. Thomas Young moving out of town, with Josiah Quincy heading off to England, with William Molyneux dying suddenly and suspiciously in October 1774. And then when people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock were headed off to Philadelphia, that is why Dr. Joseph Warren had so many responsibilities come the spring of 1775, because there was nobody left except Dr. Benjamin Church, and we know he spying for the British.
Yeah, exactly. I've never thought about that, but that is so true. Yeah.
But John, I'm going to defer the last question to you to close us out.
Okay. Nina, what surprised you most in your research for this book? And also, what questions do you wish that you had been able to answer that are still sort of hovering out there in your mind, because now that you've gotten to know these people?
Yeah, I think that I would like to know, I really would like to know the definite answer of why Dolly took so long to marry John Hancock. It's just so curious that no one waited that long. No one had long engagements. You got engaged, you got married, that was it. And maybe it's because she didn't really leave behind many letters, and certainly no journal, whereas John Hancock left so many letters that he signed, "Yours forever, I soon hope to be." Clearly he wanted to get married, or did he? I don't know. So I'd like to know the true story of that. And I also was so fascinated. I mean, it's not that I didn't know how wonderful Abigail Adams is, but boy, she really was a trooper in every sense of the word. She held the family together. Any refugee that came to her door, after Lexington and Concord and people were fleeing Boston, she took anybody in. After Josiah Quincy Jr. died, Abigail Quincy came to her door after trying to, locate the body and find out what happened to her husband. She came to Abigail Adams for comfort. I mean, everyone turned to her because she was a strong, strong person. And she hadn't had a formal education, and yet she wrote these letters to John Adams that are so stirring. And she laid out the arguments for, for ending slavery, for giving women's rights, for recognizing the rights of Native Americans. I mean, she laid out things that we should have dealt with then, and she knew that. And John Adams laughed her off a lot of the time. And I love how she would say, okay, laugh at me now, but I'm going to say it again, and then I'm going to say it again, and then I'm like, she would never just be put off by him. She just was persistent. So I think I was surprised at how really tremendously strong Abigail Adams was.
Right. Well, we've been talking with Nina Sankovitch. This is the book, American Rebels. And Nina, I want to encourage people to buy this book. So where can they buy the book? How can they reach you on Twitter? Is there a website they can go to find out more about what you're doing?
Okay. Yeah. My book can be bought, bookstores, IndieBound, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, a lot of local bookstores in New England carry it because it's such a New England book. My website is www.readallday.org, which comes back from my first book when I literally did read all day. And I'm on Facebook, Nina Sankovitch. On Twitter, I'm Read All Day. And I'm on Instagram, which is my most favorite thing to do because I just post pictures of Abigail, John, Josiah, and whoever, and some of their wonderful quotes because they have so many great quotes.
Right. Well, we really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And so on behalf of myself, JL Bell, thank you for watching today, and we'll see you next time.